I wonder if I'm gonna be able to keep this up throughout the winter. Once it starts getting cold. I don't know. I might not have it in me. Hashem, no judgment if I can't do this when it actually starts getting cold. I was thinking, the thought that just popped in my head is, am I recording this for the group again, or am I just, everything is public now, so I guess this is just a public video. Well, you can't see now you can see the unlisted videos because I made them public, but that was all training. You don't know this because I don't say it, but there's intention when I do stuff like this. In the sense that, I'm studying a book. I'm working on a book. Not my own. I mean, I have my own books, but I'm working through a book. Well, I'm working through several books. Which books? You're actually interested. I like when people are interested. Well, the first book, the book the one I'm talking about right now is Music Theory. I don't know who wrote it. Roy something, I think. I wasn't really paying attention to his name. One of his claims early on is that this is not your regular music theory book. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. I'm going through it really slow though. Last year, my God, he guided me down the path of the Hellenist Jews. So, I've been working on this project of resurrecting the Hellenist Jews Shekinah by studying the ancient Greeks and incorporating their logic, philosophy in with my Torah studies and remerging Hellenist logic and Jewish wisdom, which has been working out really well for me. I like the results that I'm seeing. I started it back in January. A really good example of a Hellenist Jew would be the work from Philo of Alexandria. Has a really good treatise on creation, where he incorporates everything he's learned from the Hellenists in breaking down basically the entirety of the creation process that Moses laid out in the Bible, in Genesis. But when I started, I didn't really know where to start, so I attempted to read some Plato to prime my mind and get the hang of exactly how these guys used to think. Reading Plato is not easy, by the way. It's not as easy as you would think, especially if you're trying to take especially if you're trying to get something out of it. Which is why I'm really impressed by the way that he laid those dialogues out. They're not long. I want to say they're I've only come across maybe one that was less than 100 pages. But 100 pages of those back and forths, it's hard to keep track of it. It's hard to keep up with it. It's hard to keep up with all of the perspectives that are being thrown around. And something I noticed about Socrates is that he knows where he's going with the conversation before he actually gets there. It's like he already knows what you're going to say and what his rebuttal's going to be. Because he seems to lure you in, lures you into contradicting yourself so that he can put the mirror up right in front of you to prove to you that you have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. Which I like that. And one of the other nice things about reading Plato, Socrates through Plato, is recognizing how fucking stupid I am. So I only made it through at the time. I Googled to see what the reading order is, and the list I found was pretty much shit. I don't know, it just bounced all over the place. But we went through Symposium, which was probably one of the hardest books I've ever read. Because it was... What was so hard about it? Oh, with all the man-boy love. Oh my god. That was the most uncomfortable, creepiest, cringiest shit I had ever read. If you never read Symposium by Plato, Socrates, well, he really doesn't come into the story until later, but it's a group of men, about 5 men, who are all just having some wine and enjoying themselves with some thoughtful discussion about love. And each man is tasked with giving a speech, an ode to love. And the common theme with all of them is the love between a man and a boy. A beautiful boy. Oh my god. Because it's not easy to relate to that. At least for me. I don't know about nobody else. I can't speak for nobody else. I remember reading that. Because I've heard that one of Socrates' crimes that he was charged with was corrupting the youth of Greece. And I'm reading that, I'm like, yeah, I can see it. This guy's talking about loving their beautiful boys and how it's their duty to raise those beautiful boys to love philosophy. So what I had to do, the only way I could get through it, because I remember I'm thinking, oh my god, I can't believe I'm fucking reading this shit right now. This is the most horrible thing. I had to take myself out of myself and recognize, all right, this is a completely different culture. These guys believe they know what they're talking about. But then the more that I got into it, I realized, you know what would make this a lot easier? You know what would make this a lot easier? Are you familiar with inner child work? It's a concept that I wasn't fully initiated into until I was 40, so that was about 4 years ago. Yeah, 4. We're almost at the 4-year mark when I learned how to do inner child work, which was something that I used to do when I was a child, but I didn't know it. I used to get visited in my mind. I used to hear voices, and one of the voices that came to me used to introduce himself as Future Derek. And what Future Derek told me, was that he was me from the future. He came from a future where he learned how to telepathically communicate with his past self. And to not worry, because no matter how hard life got, his job, Future Derek, was to make sure that he guided me, Child Derek, down the path that I needed to go down in order to grow up to be him. So I remember the first time I did inner child work. It was through a guided meditation by Aristotle. Oh, there you go. Might be my son. And the first time that we did the inner child work meditation, I remember thinking after it was done, like, holy shit, I'm Future Derek. So ever since then, I've been honing my skills with doing inner child work. Not just inner child work, but inner Derek work. That's what it kind of evolved into. Because once I learned that I could heal past traumas and wounds by going back into my past through my mind, reliving those events, and shifting my perspective on what happened, I started to do it with all my past traumas, all of my past, not even just traumas, but even with the shame, the guilt, the fear, all of the things I didn't want to remember. And even to this day, I was just doing it this morning. Thank you, Hashem. Think of it like if you ever saw Dune. If you the best example I can think of is watching Dune 2. Even though Paul does the same thing in the book. No spoilers. I only just finished chapter 23. I just finished the first chapter of the second book of Dune. Mahdi. But after Paul drinks the water of life, he's able to travel back through his ancestral DNA. And it's kind of the same thing. I did a past life regression back in 2020. And the facilitator that I was working with, normally when people do that kind of work, they go to different lives. And technically I did, but it was me. All the past lives that I was going to were my own. As in younger versions of myself. Those were my past lives. So when I was working with Symposium for the first time, and we got into the conversation of older men loving young boys, what I did was I would visualize my younger self, my childhood self, because I figure it like this. By today's standards, what these guys are talking about is equivalent to NAMBLA, the National Man-Boy Love Association, which is funny because my father used to threaten me when I was a kid. If you don't start behaving, I'm gonna sell you a little ass in NAMBLA. What's that, Dad? That's the National Man-Boy Love Association. So the only way I was able to keep up through symposium with Socrates and the rest of the boys was visualizing myself, my 43-year-old self, loving the beautiful little boy that I used to be. Because I don't think it counts as child molestation if you're doing it to yourself. Oh God, it was so cringy. I feel cringy even talking about it. But this is relative to what I was getting at with the music theory book. Once I got through symposium, I could literally feel. I could feel my brain structure had changed. But then from symposium, we moved on to Thetis, which is a dialogue that takes place the night that Socrates dies in his prison cell. Which is where he gets into the nature of the soul, which is actually a really interesting discussion, because I didn't know how seriously the Greeks took the soul. In Judaism, we call it the Shekinah. It's the feminine aspect of God. What Gnostic Jesus called the Christ. I was laughing. Yesterday I was writing a post for my group, and it came. I was like, "What'd you do today?" I asked that question. What did you do today? I was recording videos of myself walking in circles, talking to people that aren't there. But once we got out of Phaedos, then we got into Phaedrus. And then I read the first two books of Republic, but I realized each one of these books I have to read them and then reread them, because there's so much back and forth going on. And I'm trying to understand the mind of Socrates, not just the discussion itself, because the discussions that they're having, they are thought-provoking, but what I'm more interested in is how this man's mind works. So once I got to Republic, I read book 1, which was good. I had to go back and reread it though. Then I'm pretty sure I finished book 2, but then I was about to go back to it. I'm like, you know what? I need to train my brain. I need to get my brain primed for this stuff, because this is a lot. This is a lot to take in. So then that's when I decided, you know what? Let me hop over to fucking Aristotle and see how that guy works, because from my understanding, Aristotle was a student of Plato, was a student of Socrates. So if I can understand the student, then I'll have a better understanding of the teacher who taught that student. You feel me? Aristotle was incredibly daunting. Incredibly daunting. Because it's cold, hard logic. And that type of shit, it gets me all fucked up. because I have insecurities about my brain and my intellect. So what I did was, I downloaded an ebook of Aristotle. It's got like the complete works of Aristotle, right? So it's got like 8,000 pages with all of his treatises and blah, 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 blah. But it's organized really well. So it starts off with his logic, and then it goes into physics, and then it goes into, I don't know. Let me see. Let's see, is this worth it? She's Leia. Bear with me. It's the Delphi Complete. So we got logic and then physics. And then once we get through physics, then it's metaphysics. Once we get out of metaphysics, then it's ethics and politics. Now, I'd like to get through the whole fucking thing. I don't know how the hell I'm going to pull this off. I got an idea of rhetoric and poetics. There's also that. Now, during the logic, in the logic category, in the genre of logic, there's categories on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and then sophistical refutations. I'm assuming these are all in some order. And based on my experience with them so far, I believe that they are. Because I started at the top of the list and I've been working my way down. And I worked through categories first. And I remember that it was really intimidating, that first chapter of categories. So what I ended up doing was, I write a lot. I journal all day or day. So what I started to do was go paragraph by paragraph and just write out the paragraph. Because that's a technique that had worked for me in the past with helping me ingrain information and better understand information. But if you go to categories, if you've ever attempted to read categories, or if you have read categories, one sentence can be a whole page long. So it's just, what? What are you doing? What's going on here? Like, this is a lot. You got to hold on to a lot in one sentence. But at the same time, he's using words that we use today, but he's not using the common definition that we're familiar with, like predicates. I don't know grammar. I don't know conventional grammar. For the fucking life of me. Which was something that used to hold me back from writing in the past, is that I don't know grammar. I was under the assumption that you have to know the laws of grammar, the rules of grammar, in order to be able to write properly. I didn't know that wasn't actually the case. So I would always hold myself back from it. But what dawned on me as I'm going through the first portion of categories is like, this guy's fucking 2,500 years old about. And this is a translation. What we're using today is just a fucking derivative of what this man was trying to explain in this book. And it quickly came to me that he's not talking about the rules of writing. His concept of what grammar is, we see grammar like writing the ABCs and nouns and verbs and all the other shit, which it is, but he is looking at it from a much broader perspective than we are. It's not just about writing, it's about how to think and see. So once I realized that writing out a paragraph of Aristotle was way too fucking much for me, I just started going sentence by sentence. Very, very slow, very intricate, and just allowing, as I'm writing, it forces me to slow my mind down so that I can absorb the information, but then also make the connections for how it's presenting itself to me, how I make sense of it. You know what I mean? Instead of having somebody tell me what he meant and what he's talking about, I take what he's talking about and just figure it out for myself. All right, well, you know what? It sounds like you're talking about this. And then once I write out that sentence, then I'll write about it. I'll write about whatever it brings up. It may be directly related. It might not be. It might be me exploring and experimenting with the idea that he's presenting in that one sentence. But now, mind you, at the same time, I was also working with gummies. And so I think that if one were to do what I did and decide to start working with Aristotle and learning from Aristotle as a teacher, the best thing to do is to get high before you do it. because he's talking in concepts that aren't non-physical concepts that have form and shape and dimension to them. But how do you work with a three-dimensional object that doesn't have physical form? Does that make sense? And it's not even these aren't even three-dimensional. These are four-dimensional concepts. Like, for instance, once we finish categories, because categories sets us up on interpretation. If you haven't read categories, then on interpretation might go a little bit over your head, because on interpretation is all about one of the four forms. Is it 4 or 5? Is it 4 or 5? One of the 5 forms of opposition in the terms of affirmatives in relation to negatives, negations, negation and affirmation. And that's basically the main idea of on interpretation. But you're not going to know exactly what that means if you haven't worked through categories. I'm not saying that you can't. You can obviously watch Return of the Jedi without ever having seen A New Hope or The Empire Strikes Back. Nobody's stopping you. You can kind of fill in the gaps as you see fit. But if you want the full scope of things, it would obviously make the most sense that you watch A New Hope before you watch Return of the Jedi, after you watch Empire Strikes Back. You know what I mean? Like, and granted, again, you can watch them in any fucking order that you want. But my experience has proven that I have a much better understanding of the one after seeing the one that it's predicable of, one is predicated on. Because you got to understand that A New Hope is predicable of Return of the Jedi, but Return of the Jedi is predicated on Empire Strikes Back. See, now, I didn't know that you can use that's how you can use the word predicate. I didn't know that's how you predicate things. I was under the impression that a predicate, and I remember because in the first chapter, like right in the beginning, he gets into predicates and not unequivocally. What's the opposite of unequivocally? Equivocally. The equivocation of words, the equivocation of subjects, but at the same time, how we can actually make up words that are derivative of other words. Like equivocation is the verb form of equivocal. Am I remembering this correctly? Unequivocal is when things are exactly as we say they are. Unequivocally. But when two things are equivocal, they're not the same. They may sound similar, but they're not the same thing. They're two different things. There may be some connection, but there's not much. It's just like how the species of man and the species of horse are equivocal because they're both predicated on the genera of animal. But never once is a horse a man, nor a man a horse. You feel me? I mean, unless we're getting into centaurs, but that's a whole other fucking story. So for me, going through those books, sentence by sentence by sentence by sentence, it helped reshape my brain and my mind so that I have a better understanding of that which we have not come to yet. In the sense that by writing out sentence by sentence chapter 1 of categories, it was easier. I was more susceptible to the information that was being presented in chapter 2. Which I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, delves into one of the 8 forms of thought, specifically substance. Now, mind you, it took me about 2 months to get through categories. Maybe a month and a half, 2 months to get through that entire book, writing sentence by sentence. And I'm doing other stuff too. I have other things that I'm working on, so it's like I'm juggling things. Once we finished categories, then we got to go into on interpretation, which was helpful. In the sense that it taught me a different way of interpreting any subsequent works that I felt called to study. Because in the first chapter of On Interpretation, Aristotle, he gets into how any work that you might come across, regardless of what language that it's translated into, ultimately that work, the real deeper aspects of it are going to live behind the words. And that even if a work is translated into fucking a million different languages, and even to a degree, he doesn't say this, but we can make this argument that even if one were to attempt to mistranslate something intentionally, for instance, like the Bible, the New Testament, if someone were to intentionally misinterpret it, the meaning, the soul of it's still in there, but you have to look for it behind the words. And what On Interpretation helped me learn how to do is take a very confusing concept, an incredibly confusing concept, and instead of attempting to make sense of it how I think it should be made sense of, to feel it. Do I feel what this is saying? I can't understand what the fuck he's talking about, but do I at least feel it? Can I feel it? Like, what will make it make more sense? Well, it makes more sense if I look at it from this perspective instead of that perspective. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, for instance, he gets into verbs. Verbs and nouns. Because as we learned in the first chapter, the soul expresses itself through the sentences that we enunciate, which are composed of words, which are composed of syllables. And it may not necessarily be the words that we're seeing. The words that we're seeing may not necessarily be the thought, the idea that's being expressed by the soul of the one who created the work in the first place. But that's why it's important for us to look at it from a deeper perspective and try to find out what it's saying to us. That's why going to school and having somebody tell you what something is, what something means, what something doesn't mean, that isn't going to work. That doesn't work anymore. Because that person, that teacher, is only telling you what they were told to tell you. They don't really even know. That's why when we look at grammar today, that's why I say when we look at grammar today, grammar's been reduced down to this concept of writing and structure form. But at the same time, that's not really it. Because if we take what Aristotle was saying about sentence structure and the words and the syllables to express the soul's purpose, we can just as easily take out literal alphanumeric words. A painter, their sentences are the strokes of their brushes. The words that they use is the paint. Or even a sculptor. His sentence is the marble or the clay that he's molding. And each line, each chisel is one of his sentences or one of his syllables that ultimately creates this piece. So it's not that we just simply are talking about words, because again, we're going back 2,500 years where we're talking about a civilization that doesn't have smartphones, they don't have TV to fuck with them. They're not playing video games. And I'm not saying that they weren't that many of the people weren't working dead-end jobs, but I guarantee you that the average Greek wasn't working at Hugo Boss, folding shirts all day, just standing around waiting for someone to come in so they can collect a little bit of commission. It don't work like that. I mean, we can guarantee it because the bourgeoisie revolution didn't even start until, another fucking 1,500 years after Aristotle died. So we're talking about a completely alien civilization, an ancient alien civilization. It was the Greeks, they were humans. When I say alien, I'm not talking about extraterrestrial. Although I'm not talking about extraterrestrial either. Because they had their own run-ins with divine entities and divine entities. What are those? They're nothing but extraterrestrials. God's an extraterrestrial. God's home base isn't Earth necessarily. The fucking creator of the goddamn universe. But once we get into nouns and verbs with Aristotle and on interpretation, what we start to learn is his idea of a verb. I mean, it's not too far off. It's an action word. Well, technically it's an action, it's a noun, because what's a noun? A noun is a person, place, or thing. A verb is an action, is a word that describes an action, which is a thing. So a verb is essentially a four-dimensional noun, because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when we talk about, when we say the word jump, when you read the word jump, you know what happened. Someone bent down, they jumped up, and then they came back down again. It takes place over a window of time. It's a thing that happened over a period of time. It has a beginning point, an ending point, and some shit that happens in between. It's not like a regular noun. It's not like, hey, tree. Although essentially, I mean, you could say that a tree is also four-dimensional in that sense, in that it grows, it does things, but where the noun is just an idea, a verb is a noun, a living noun, an active noun. I can see that. Makes sense to me. Now, once we get out of on interpretation, because as we go deeper into on interpretation, it's really just about the enunciation of negatives and affirmations, negations and affirmations, which leads us into prior analytics, which is what I'm working on right now. I'm about halfway through the first book of prior analytics. I'm on chapter 22. What'd you do on your Saturday night? Well, last night I spent about 2 hours working through the first half of the 22nd chapter of the first book of prior analytics. Yeah, what'd you learn? What did I learn? Oh boy. I learned that when we're using a third figure syllogism, that if one premise is affirmative, well, hold on, let's go back. Let's take it the way it was. If both premises are affirmative, one being necessary and the other being problematic, then it's necessary that we're going to have a problematic conclusion. Now, if we have a negative proposition and an affirmative premise, but the affirmative is necessary, then we're going to have, again, and the affirmative is necessary, but the negative is problematic. That again, I believe we're going to have a problematic conclusion. But if we have a necessary negative and the affirmative is problematic, then we'll actually have two conclusions where we'll have a negative problematic, but also a negative pure syllogism. But at the same time, regardless of which figure that we're working with, we will never conclude with a necessary negative. Do you understand? So it's like, all right. I mean, we may be able to achieve a pure negative syllogism, but it's not necessary. Which is a big deal, because if it was necessary, then that means that it's an absolute, like it has to be. But because it's a negative, because we have the negative problematic, just by default, there is going to be a pure syllogism encoded, the potential for a pure syllogism, a pure negative, encoded within that negative problematic. You feel what I'm saying? But even still, that pure negative is not going to be necessary. And the reason for that, and this just dawned on me last night, because it's just like, this is one of those things where it's like, fuck, I can't believe I didn't even realize this. As I was working through these equations, because that's what syllogism really boils down to. That's what logic, that's what Aristotelian logic really boils down to, is that it's mathematics just without numbers. Because every syllogism is an equation, and that we have three figures of syllogism. You got third figure, second figure, and first figure. But what unites them all is the fact that each one of them, with the exception of first figure, can only achieve, at the best, can only achieve an imperfect syllogism. But that's where first figure syllogism comes into play, because first figure syllogism is the only type of syllogism that will conclude in an imperfect syllogism, but it also has the potential. It is the only form of syllogism that has the potential to be perfected into a perfect syllogism. So in order to even achieve that, you have to be able to know how to convert your second and third figure syllogisms into a first figure syllogism. Because if you don't know how to convert, then you're not going to be able to achieve any sort of perfection at all, for that matter. Because you have to realize that even a first figure imperfect syllogism is more perfect than an imperfect second or third figure syllogism. And now, mind you, second and third form syllogism, come on, they're the same fucking thing, essentially. So rather than the middle term being on the outside of the minor premise, in a second form, like it would be in a third figure, in the second figure, the middle term is outside of the major premise. So there is that little bit of a differential. So there's going to be some variations with what you can and can't do between the two minor syllogisms. So what rules apply to the third figure may not necessarily apply to the second figure. Although, if you can, both figures can be converted into a first figure. And once you can perfect it into a first figure, then it's just a matter of doing some serious brain fucking and refining that imperfect first figure syllogism into a perfect syllogism. Do you feel? So what I like about it is that there's a little bit of, there's an element of, we need to be able to understand a little bit of the concepts of alchemy. So basically, once we have an imperfect first figure syllogism, then it's just a matter of just really diving into it, breaking the argument down into its fundamental components, removing any and or all imperfections of that argument itself before we can put it back together again and go, God damn, we got a perfect syllogism. And I already hear you. What's the difference between an imperfect and a perfect syllogism? Like, what do you mean? Well, that's a great question, because the difference between a perfect syllogism and an imperfect syllogism is the fact that an imperfect syllogism, typically what we have to do is, it's not, how do you say it? The sky is blue, right? I mean, it's very basic, and it's not even a syllogism. But when I say the sky is blue, you know what I'm talking about, right? Well, I don't have to prove it to you. Just by the very fact, the sky is blue. Oh yeah, no, I know. Exactly. That's how you know a perfect syllogism from an imperfect syllogism. So when we present a perfect syllogism, it proves itself just by its very existence. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need to take any more steps. Now, when it comes to an imperfect syllogism, you're going to have to do a little extra work to make sense of it to who you're speaking with, or who you're presenting your case to. So, one of Aristotle's main processes of proving an imperfect syllogism relies on what is that called? Impossible? Well, I don't remember the term used for the process itself, but basically what you do is you need to in order to prove the syllogism, in order to prove the imperfect syllogism, what you need to do is disprove its contradiction. Okay? So for instance, hey, the sky is blue. You may bust my balls, but like, oh yeah, prove it. I go, okay, all right, smarty pants. Well, let me show you something. This is pink, all right? That lighter is pink. Now, it's hard to tell because of all the cloudiness, but you can kind of see the general bluish hue. The general bluish hue of the sky behind me, above me. Now, what we can tell is, when I lift this lighter up, right, you see the pink? That's not the same color as the sky. So we know that the sky isn't pink. See, but now here's the thing with syllogism. Because syllogism is really, it seems like a really easy concept, and it's not. It's not an easy concept, but where it gets really fucked up is that in today's society, we're very used to, we're conditioned to think in black and white terms, yes and no. You feel me? So when it comes to syllogism, we're actually working with three different terms. We're working with a major term, a middle term, and a minor term. And what's the purpose of syllogism? The purpose of syllogism is to find the relativity between three different things. So for instance, man and horse, man does not belong to horse, nor does horse belong to man, but both man and horse belong to animal. You feel me? A belongs to all B. A belongs to all C. B may belong to some C. Therefore, A may belong to some B because A belongs to all C, and because B may belong to all C, the potential of A belonging to some B is there, although we can't necessarily prove it at the time. So the best that we can conclude is that being that A belongs to all C and C belongs to some B, maybe, potentially, there's the potential. Because if B may belong to some C, then we can convert that premise and say that C may belong to some B just as B may belong to some C. But in doing so, what we just did was convert the third figure syllogism into a first form syllogism by converting the minor and middle proposition. Right? So I'll give you that same example again. This is a third figure syllogism. A belongs to no B. A belongs to no C, right? A is the major, B is the minor, C is the middle term. The middle term is outside. The major term sits next to the minor term, and the middle term sits outside of the middle, or outside of the minor. No. And what we're doing is we're finding the relation between the three terms. And like I said, what we know is A belongs to no C. I know I said I was going to use the same one, but I changed my mind. A belongs to no C. But at the same time, B may belong to some C, or to all C, rather. We're going to mix this up a little bit. All right, I'll say it one more time. A belongs to no C. But B may belong to all C. That right there, that's a third figure syllogism right there. Now, let A, B, and C be whatever the fuck you want them to be, okay? The AC relationship is a pure relationship. It's pure. As in, there's no doubt about it. A does not belong to C. That's called a universal, it's a universal negative proposition. Now, the BC relationship, B may belong to all C. That's a problematic affirmative universal. Because we're relating to all of C, not some of C, but all of C. Now, in order to convert that from a third figure to a first figure, we need to take the middle term and get it back into the middle. That's how we perfect it, by getting the middle term back into its original place where it's supposed to be, in between the two. So, being that we know that B may belong to some C, or to all C, when we convert, a universal problematic can be converted into a particular problematic. So, where B may belong to all C, C may belong to some B. Why do we know that? Why can't C belong to all B? Because we don't know. That's why it's called a problematic, because there's no definitive conclusion there. And just because, so try to imagine that B is a big circle, right? B is a big circle, and inside that big circle that we call B, there's a little circle that we're calling, inside that big circle that we're calling B is a smaller circle within its area that we call C. So we know that B belongs to all C. So no matter where you go in C, there is a little bit of B in there. But at the same time, because B is a bigger circle, because B may be a bigger circle, there is the potential for that B being a bigger circle. There's going to be some of B that does not belong to C. So although B may belong to all C, C at best may belong to some B. And because C may belong to some B, we can further conclude now that because we know for certain that A does not belong to C at all, that it is possible that A may not belong to some B. Because if A belonged to all of B, for instance, that would contradict the AC relationship if it proves to be so that C belongs to some B. So even if A belongs to some B, it cannot belong to what aspects of B for which C belongs. And we did this by converting our third figure into a first figure. So we perfected it. We perfected the third figure by making it into a first figure. And then, now at the same time, check this out. Technically, if I'm thinking about this the right way, and I think I believe I am, but we have two conclusions. Because we know that A may not belong to some B. It's also true that A may not belong to all of B. A may be its own independent, separate player in this whole equation. Yeah, it's one thing to write that shit out, but it's another thing to fucking actually talk about it and try to like rationalize out of your head. Oh, baby boy. Now, mind you, that we're only taking, for example, that one syllogism. But you see how we were able to break it down and make it make sense? That's the idea of syllogism. So back in Aristotle's day, the way that it seems to me is Aristotle's a grammarian, as in he's an expert in grammar. The opposite of a grammarian is a sophist. A sophist is someone who existed in those ancient Greek days. And basically sophism is what runs this world now. These are the people that, they don't actually say anything that's true. And if they do, we don't really know because they bury their truth in lies. So you have a hard time discerning what's truth and what's lie. And they use wordsmithing to convince you of something that may not actually be true. Even if they know it's not true, they just want you to think a certain way. So they'll do and say whatever they gotta do and say in order to pull you towards them. Now that's the opposite of a grammarian who is going to refute that which the sophist has to say by just using basic logic. And I say basic, and I know like when people say like today in today's world, oh, you got to use your critical thinking. But how many critical thinkers out there are trained in the art of grammarianism? This fucking guy is using 2,000-year-old dead Greek logic. Yeah. Ugh. How was that? That was good. So now mind you, I'm only on chapter 23, or chapter 22 of prior analytics. So prior analytics is 46 chapters long. So I'm already been at this for about 3 months now. I got another 3 months, about 3 months before I finish book 1. Then there's book 2. And once we finish book 2, which probably be like, I don't know, maybe next year I'll be done with fucking book 2. But then we have posterior analytics, which I don't even know what the hell I'm getting into there. And then from posterior analytics, then we get into topics. And what's such a pain in the ass is that Aristotle, he teased topics on interpretation. He teased it because he brings up a concept and he's like, well, if you read topics, no, I haven't read topics yet. I haven't even gotten through this book. What the hell are you talking about? So basically what he's just letting us know is once you get to topics, then everything else that led up to it, right? So we came down this timeline, beep, 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 and now we're at topics. Once we read topics, we're going to find out that thing, which is going to make everything else make even more sense. But then once we finish topics, then that last book, like I said, it was called Sophistical Refutations. And what I believe is, just based on the name, is that book is more than likely going to focus on the refutation. It's going to focus on the art of refuting the sophist. And like I said, if we look around, especially with politics today, politics, business, all these things, even interpersonal relationships, sophism, whether people know it or not, we are constantly being bombarded with people who want us to think the way that they want us to think. It's gaslighting, essentially. A sophist is a gaslighter. They just had a more sophisticated name. So for instance, let's say, and I really do like that connection between the sophist and the sophisticants. So take any sophisticated looking person, right? That person, they're putting on a show. That's not really who they are. That's just who they present themselves to be to you, because they're selling you an image of who they are not. Because if you knew them behind the sophistication, you would see that they have no substance. Look at that shit-eating grin on his face. Yeah. What happens when you live in a reality where nobody tells you that you're wrong anymore? And even if they do attempt to tell you that you're wrong, they don't know that you've been trained by a 2,500-year-old grammarian on how to see through the bullshit. Now, what kind of evil can I do with this? Oh, lots. Well, we gotta understand, too. What's good for you is evil for me. Good is considered evil to the good. Good is considered evil to the evildoer who considers himself a good guy. Do you feel me? Thank you, Hashem. Which is an interesting take, because if we go to Philo's treatise on the creation, Philo, he's a first century. He was a Jew. He was a Hellenist Jew from the second half of the first century. He was alive during the time of Jesus. But Philo lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and he was a student at the Library of Alexandria obviously before it was burnt down. So he was trained, he was learned in Plato, in Aristotle, in Pythagoras, in Socrates. He knew his shit. And one of his attempts were, like his contemporary Flavius Josephus, the historian Jew, who was working with the Roman Empire at the time, they were trying to bring Judaism, the concepts and ideas of Judaism, to a much wider audience than just the consolidation that the Jews were trying to keep to themselves, the Pharisees were trying to keep for themselves. Because the Pharisees, they didn't want to share this. They didn't want to share Torah with the rest of the world. But that's why we've been getting our asses kicked for thousands of years. Because we hoard the information, and then we use it for bad stuff. And God punishes us for doing that. That's why we're in exile. That's where all of this started from. Because technically the exile began with Solomon. After the death of Solomon, God was so just sickened by the behavior of King Solomon towards the end of his life that he said, I'm taking this kingdom away from you. But I'm going to wait till you're dead. When your son takes over, I'm taking Israel away from the kingdom of David. Now, because of the promise I made to your father, King David, because of the promise I made to David, I'm going to allow you to keep the kingdom of Judah. And you get to keep the tribe of Benjamin. But everyone else is going to Israel. Everyone else gets to stay in Israel. And then if we go to, I believe it's 1 Kings chapter 11 is when this takes place. So if you need reference, it's actually Kings 1, chapter 11, verse 38 and 39 is where God proposes to a man named Jeroboam from the tribe of Ephraim, one of the tribes of Joseph, one of the two tribes of Joseph, that he will make the bloodline of Ephraim into a kingdom like he had done for David. So if we fast forward to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37 of Ezekiel, I think it's around chapter 37, verse 15 to 25, I believe, is where God says that he'll reunite the kingdom of Israel, no problem, but not until David and Ephraim, the bloodlines of David and Ephraim come back together again, that they come into union, because there can't be two kings. There's got to be one. Now, most people don't even know who Ephraim is, but I mean that's a whole other thing. That's like some Dune shit right there. You think of it like you can almost think of it like the bloodline of David would be like the bloodline of the Atreides, and the bloodline of Ephraim is like the bloodline of the Harkonnens. Spoiler: Paul's a Harkonnen through his mother. Now, in the New Testament, they do get into the New. You don't know this, but the New Testament's all about that. That's what that's what Jesus was doing. When Jesus was working with the Samaritans, he was kind of rebuilding a gap. He was bridging a gap between the Jews and the Samaritans, because it doesn't get into this anywhere. But after Israel falls, right after God splits the kingdom, you got the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. Some people mistakenly call it the northern and south kingdom. No. Israel, Judah, anyone from the tribe of Judah, they're banished from Israel altogether. Get the fuck out. You are not allowed back there. You're done. Not until David's DNA and Ephraim's DNA come into union, right? But after the kingdom split, there's a lot of internal conflicts that go on. And eventually the Assyrians come in and they conquer Israel before the Babylonians come in and conquer the kingdom of Judah, right? Because the Babylonians, they didn't conquer Israel, they conquered Judah. What happened from here is that predominantly the people from the kingdom of Judah, from the southern kingdom, from that kingdom, the people that were left, and this isn't the case because there's Jews in the Bible prior to this happening. But one way to look at it is that the Jews are the remnants of the people from the kingdom of Judah, and the Samaritans are the remnants of the people from the kingdom of Israel. It's not just a religion. Like I've seen it written that the difference between Jews and Samaritans is like a little bit different translation of their religions. It has nothing to do with religion. I mean, it does and it doesn't. People eventually made it into a religion, but it's an inheritance. It's an inheritance thing. It's a spiritual inheritance. It's patrimony. It's a patrimonial. It's a patrimonial dispute. Who gets to be the king? I want to be the king. No, I'm the king. All right. This is where God comes in. All right. You can both be king at the same time, but you have to have a baby. What? That's the way it works. Now we actually know how it works. We can figure out how it works if we study the laws of Torah. Towards the end of Numbers, there's a particular case that comes up that Moses actually has to go directly to God, because when it's presented to him, so the idea was Moses had set up officials and magistrates to kind of help settle any disputes among the people in the community, and if a case was too challenging for them, that's when they would go to Moses. And if Moses couldn't figure it out, then Moses went right to fucking God, and then God laid down the law. So what ended up happening was, prior to the 40 years of wandering, there was a man from the tribe of Manasseh, which is one of the two tribes of Joseph. He died. He died in the wilderness because of his transgressions. But he didn't have any sons. He only had 3 daughters. So the daughters, they went to the officials and said to them, like, what about us? Like, our father, he died in the wilderness. Like, what about his inheritance? Like, what's going to happen with all that? Because in true Judaism, it's patrimonial based. It's not matrimonial based. Religious Jews altered that. They made that their own thing. Take them out of the equation. Take the religious Jews out of the equation. Judaism has nothing to do with your mother. It has nothing to do with your mother. As a matter of fact, if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 23, there are instructions on what to do if an Israelite man, a Jewish man, has a child with a non-Jewish woman. So there are rules to that. And what happens in that situation is that the child is not allowed into the congregation until their third generation, which is usually probably around like age 40 to 45. So they have to wait most of their life before they're allowed in. which is basically what happened with me. My father has Israelite ancestry. Now, I don't know about my mother's. That's the thing. I don't know if there's any Israelite DNA in my mom. But based on some genetic testing, it looks like she does have some Muslim DNA in her, some Islamic DNA in her, which would link her back to Egypt, because that's where if we follow the ancestral timeline of Islam, which is predicated on a man named Ishmael, who is the first son of Abraham. His mother was an Egyptian slave. She was a daughter of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gave her to Abraham. It's complicated. But specifically, in chapter 23 of Deuteronomy, we learn that if an Israelite man has a child with either a Moabite woman or a Egyptian woman, then the child's allowed in. It's just not until later in life. Now, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, the two tribes of Joseph, those are the only two tribes that have Egyptian matrilineal descent. Because Joseph was married to an Egyptian woman. He was married to a daughter of Isis, like a high priestess in Egypt. So what ended up happening was these three women who lost their father, because when you follow the law, inheritance is passed down from father to son. Nothing goes to the daughter, except in the situation like this. So they go to the officials, they go to the elders, and they say, our father died. What about our inheritance? What about his name? His name's going to get lost because we don't have a brother. The officials, the elders, they don't know what to do. So they're like, hey, Moses, here's what's going on. And Moses goes, oh shit, I have no idea. And so he goes, God, Hashem, what do we do in this situation? And just like that, Hashem comes through and he goes, all right, here's how you do it. Here's the order of operations. If a man dies without a son, so as that his name is not lost, what we're going to do is, if he has daughters, his inheritance will go to his daughters. But there is a caveat. Those daughters are prohibited from marrying outside of their tribe. So using the three daughters of the tribe of Manasseh, their father's inheritance comes to them. His entire estate is split up between the three. In order for them to keep the estate, in order to keep the inheritance from their father, including the spiritual inheritance, because that's a really big part of it. Because normally that spiritual patrimony gets passed down through the Y chromosome. But in this particular case, if there is no Y chromosome, then that spiritual patrimony will be passed down through the patrimonial X chromosome. The X chromosome that a girl gets from her father. And then that will be passed down. Now, if she marries into a different tribe, for instance, if one of these girls from the tribe of Manasseh, if they marry someone from the tribe of Asher, for instance, they lose it. It's gone. But if they marry within their tribe, that's a whole different story. That's a whole different bottle of wax. You feel me? Because now at that point, whatever child that they have, let's say they have a son, just to keep it simple, that son is going to get the patrimonial inheritance from his father, but then also his mother as well, from his grandfather, through his mother. That's actual Jewish law. That's how it's supposed to be. Not take Talmudic Jews out of the equation, because religious Jews, they follow the Talmud. The Talmud is not the law of God. It's the law of it's man's interpretation. It's a interpretation of Torah. And even still, if you go through some of the aspects of Talmud, they do take stuff away. They only practice what's convenient. So, for instance, there's a law that says that if, let's say I have a brother, but he's from my mother's side. We don't have the same father. But let's just say I had a brother from my father's side, right? I get married to a woman, but I die before we can have kids. My wife, by rights, has the opportunity to get with my brother. It's technically my brother's obligation to take my wife and have a child with her. And then that first child that they have together counts as mine, so as to not so that my name doesn't get lost in history. Does that make sense? This is like heavy shit. Like we don't worry about stuff like this in today's society. But this is the old way of doing it. This is the new way. The new old way. So when people say, so like a good example would be like in the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, right? In the New Testament, there's two conflicting genealogies of Jesus. Well, this one says Solomon, this one says Nathan. I mean, they both can't be right. Technically, they can. Because Nathan was a son of David. So let's just say that Nathan had a wife, but he died without children. Then his wife would technically be passed down to Solomon, and would be Solomon's obligation to have a child with that woman. Now, technically, that child would be considered Nathan's, although genetically, that child would be Solomon's. So we can make the case. We can easily make the case. Although we don't have any documentation to prove it 100%, we can use syllogistic thought and conclude that it's not impossible. Although not necessary, this is a problematic proposition. But it's not impossible that both Luke and Matthew are both correct in that, let's just say that scenario that I just played out is exactly what happened. If that scenario is what happened, and we have nothing to say that it didn't happen. We have no means of saying that it didn't happen. So for all intents and purposes, something we learn with problematic propositions is that if A may possibly belong to no C, we can convert. We can do another form of conversion. We can do a problematic conversion. So a negative problematic can be converted into an affirmative problematic. So like I said, A may possibly not belong to any C. We can then convert that problematic and say that it's just as probable that A may possibly belong to all C. Just as, now I'm using a universal proposition. We can also do that with a particular proposition as well. So A may possibly not belong to some C. All right, no problem. It's just as probable that A may belong to some C. So using that way of thinking, I've been waiting for this. Oh my God, thank you, Hashem. I've been waiting to use syllogistic thinking to prove something. So So what we can say is, hypothetically speaking, Nathan was married to a woman. Nathan was married to a woman, but he died before he had a child. So his wife got passed down to Solomon, because we know that Solomon had 400 wives. So we can't say that one of his wives wasn't one of those 400 women. May possibly have been the wife of his dead brother, for which it was then Solomon's obligation to have a child with his wife, and then that child would have been considered Nathan's. Although, genetically speaking, from one perspective, yes, it's Nathan's son. From another perspective, yes, it's Solomon's son, because it was Solomon's sperm that penetrated that egg. Yeah, so you want to talk some shit? We can make some shit happen. So the next time you ever hear anybody talking shit about Jesus and his lineage, and they go, well, what, the one book and the other book. All right, well, here's a scenario for you, Einstein. What do you think about this? Well, the books don't say that. Okay, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So now let's go back. Now that we have all of that in our mind, let's go back to the scenario of how the fuck is the bloodline of Ephraim and the bloodline of David going to come together? Because literally, that would, if the monarchy is passed down through the Y chromosome, if inheritance of the kingdom of Israel is passed down through the Y chromosome, how do we get to that point? How can you get two Y chromosomes to mix like that? All right, well, here you go, smarty pants. Let's go back to the case of the daughters of Manasseh, the daughters of the tribe of Manasseh. Let's just say that somewhere between the fall of Israel and the fall of Judah, and right this second, somewhere down the line, a direct. Now, here's another important thing. In Ezekiel, we find out, after God says that Ephraim and David come together, he then says, David shall rule forever. So what that means, how I interpret that is, the bloodline of David and the bloodline of Ephraim have to come together to make a child, but the father has to be a direct ancestor of David, and the mother needs to be a direct ancestor of Ephraim, right? So somewhere along the lines, a direct descendant of Ephraim has to die only having a daughter, or several daughters for that matter. And then one of his daughters, and then that patrimonial ancestry would be passed down as long as that daughter then marries a direct descendant of David and they have a child, then that child will be the Kwisatz Haderach. Does that make sense? So I'll say that again, that a direct descendant of Ephraim, someone who's of the Ephraim bloodline, whether they know it or not, he has a daughter and then dies before he has a son. We can then invoke the law. That is prescribed at the end of Numbers, and say that the male inheritance, the patrimony, is then going to be passed down through the mother because there was no son. That daughter, that woman, goes about her life and then finds and marries a man who is a direct descendant of David, okay, when they have a child, that child has two birthrights. He has the birthright of his father's, the patrimony from his father. That's one birthright. He'll be the inheritor of all things that come with being of the line of David. While at the same time, he will have a second birthright through his mother that comes with being of the tribe of Ephraim, which are the two royal bloodlines of Israel. Because like we were saying, in Kings 1, chapter 11, that's where we find out that God makes a separate deal with Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim. Now here's the funny thing, is like if we go back to Genesis, Joseph already knew this. Joseph knew that. God told Joseph about this generations beforehand. When Joseph was in Egypt, he and God had a secret pact that nobody knew about. It's not even in the Bible. Joseph alludes to it. Knowing the story of Joseph, if you don't know the story of Joseph, go back and read your Genesis. Start from the beginning and read all the way fucking through. It'll take you a week. Or a day if you're fucking that quick of a reader. When Joseph finally reveals his true identity to his brothers, he says to them, so as to ease their suffering and to ease their guilt, shame, and fear, he says to them, so it wasn't you who sent me here, it was God. But he goes on. It wasn't you who sent me here, it was God. And he made me father of Pharaoh and lord over the whole of Egypt. Now, the word Pharaoh, that means king. So it wasn't you who sent me here, it was God. And he made me the father of the king. Derek, that alarm is fucking annoying as shit. I know. That's why it's there. Now, primitives. Now, if we go back to what separates the Jews and the Samaritans, the Samaritans believe that their Messiah is going to be from the line of Joseph. Jews believe that their Messiah is going to be from the line of David. That's why Jews, we have two Messiahs. We have Moshiach ben David and Moshiach ben Yosef. The Messiah from the tribe of Joseph and the Messiah from the tribe of David, from the line of David. But what all those Jews seem to fail to recognize is that one verse in Ezekiel 37, and no, they don't even ignore it, but they don't give it the justice that it deserves, where God tells Ezekiel, take a stick, write the name of Joseph on it. Take another stick and write the name of Judah on it. Now put those two together. Now put them together. Now I don't know. Call me crazy, but my interpretation of that is quite simple. When the family tree, right, the stick. Where does the stick come from? The stick comes from a tree. When the family tree of Judah and the family tree of Joseph become one tree. Because as God said, there cannot be two kings, there must be one. That's me, by the way. Don't worry about me trying to prove it. Don't worry about me proving it. God's going to prove it for me. I don't have to do anything. Don't worry about it. Like a lot of Talmudic Jews, a lot of religious Jews, what they'll say is, well, this guy, the Moshiach, he's going to have to prove his lineage. No, he doesn't. He doesn't have to do shit. That's not true. I have it direct from the Lord himself that he does all that. That's his job. You don't worry about that. Because if you put too much effort into trying to prove something to somebody, you're just going to disprove yourself. You're going to call your own self into question. Let me do it for you because I know what the fuck I'm doing because I'm God. Thank you, my Lord. I love you too. Now, Hashem, is there anything really specific that you want me to do? Like, let's say that there's somebody watching this and they're kind of like on the fence. Like, is this dude really like the resurrection of Moses? Like, what is it? Just keep on talking because you're doing an amazing job. Okay. Yeah, but is there something specific? Leave it to me. I know, but is there something that I can say? Just so I can get a shit-eating grin on my face like I am. Oh, did I do it? Oh, okay. So anybody who actually knows what I'm talking about knows what I'm talking about, and they know. Is that what you're saying? That's exactly what I'm saying. So, my Lord, what do I need to do to get my inheritance? You already have it. Yeah. Good. Keep your money. Shove your money right up your whore's ass. One of my favorite lines from one of my favorite laws from Deuteronomy. This is the best one. No woman, no Israelite woman shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any Israelite man be a cult prostitute. Keep your whore fee and keep your pay of a dog, for the Lord finds that shit abhorrent. Now back 3,000 years ago, I mean, what's a cult prostitute? I don't know, but what's a cult prostitute today? Because the idea is to integrate the laws of Torah so that they flow within the modern world. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's all about interpretation of the law. So Jews are technically, every Jew is obligated to be an expert in the law. Not just Kabbalah, not just the mystical shit, but an expert in the law. Not Talmudic law, because that's not Torah. God did not transmit Talmud down to Moses. That is the work of the Pharisees. The same Pharisees who are in the New Testament, those are the guys. You want to find out who they didn't kill Jesus, by the way. God killed Jesus. They just allowed it to happen. God used them to kill Jesus. Jesus knew he was going to die long before anybody else knew he was going to die. He knew he was going to die from the very beginning, because if you go to the book of Matthew, he makes a reference to Jonah. And if you don't know the story of Jonah, then you don't know what he's talking about. And what he's talking about is, we don't have free will. Jews don't have free will. Well, hold on. Prophets don't have free will. If you're a prophet, if you are a servant of God, not just a Jew, but an actual servant prophet, you do not get free will. That's a luxury that is given to everybody else but you. You can attempt to utilize your free will and run like Jonah did, but just like Jonah, your ass didn't get dragged all the fucking way back to shore. Because when God has a job for you, you're going to do that fucking job, whether you like it or not. He said the same thing to Ezekiel. I believe it was Ezekiel. It was either Ezekiel or Jeremiah, who said to him, "But Lord, you want me to prophesy to these people? They'll kill me. They'll tear me to shreds." You know what God said to him? "I don't give a shit. Either you go out there and you smash these people, or I'm going to smash you in front of them." Okay. All right. No problem. See, now the difference between then and now is that now we have technology. So now I could do my job. I could do the job of all my ancestors and all my predecessors just with this. Easy peasy. As long as there's a potential for a witness, that's it. You can refute me, but by the time I'm done recording this and by the time I upload it, I mean, the damage is already done, so to speak. The work's already been concluded. And once this is uploaded, it's not my fault that you're not listening. It's not my fault that you're not watching. I'm just telling you how it is. I'm not telling you what to believe either. I'm not saying, oh, well, you gotta believe me. Fuck that. I'm just a guy. I'm a false prophet from your perspective. But that's because I'm my own prophet. You know what I mean? So the philosophy goes like this. Be your own prophet. Be your own Messiah. This way you know how to differentiate the false ones from the real ones. Because if you're the real prophet, if you're the real Messiah, then everybody else is a false prophet. Does that make sense? Be your own Christ. Be your own Messiah. Be your own prophet through which the Lord speaks. And when the Lord tells you to record yourself and start talking some shit, you make sure you get your ass on that phone and start talking some shit. So now, how does this all relate back to what I was saying before about the music theory? So basically, the concept that we learned in music theory last night is one of the benefits of learning music theory is that it will actually change your brain structure. Because what you're doing is you're learning a new skill, and that skill that you're learning is activating dormant aspects of your brain for which that you were not using before. Now, just because you're learning music theory doesn't mean that those now active aspects of your brain, those new synapses, they aren't just going to be exclusively used just for music theory. No. A couple years back, I got into the habit of writing with my left hand. And the reason I got into the habit of writing with my left hand was to form new synapses in the atrophied part of my right brain. Because I practice astrology, I practice divination, I practice tarot cards. Or I use them. I don't practice it, I just use them. From time to time. I don't really... what I do isn't even astrology. Technically, it's astronomy. But I realized, or it came to me, thank you, Asheb, that in order to, those arts require an exercised, a developed right hemisphere of your brain. So by writing with my left hand, what that was doing was it was allowing me to exercise that side of my brain in such a way that it would become more developed than what it was in the average person. You feel me? So something that Philo talks about a lot. Is during his breakdown of creation is how God came about creating the world. And where he gets on is that the physical creation is actually predicated on an intellectual model that came first. The intellectual model was the basis for which the physical final product was developed from. So first had to come the archetypal components of the universe itself. So we could argue, right? Let's just say that, and we can merge modern science and we can merge Big Bang theory with creation theory right now by saying that, all right, I'll concede to say that it's not impossible that Big Bang theory is correct. The sun came first, then came the earth, and blah, 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 blah. All the evolution, millions and billions of years. Yeah, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But are you willing to concede that the order of operations from which we see in Genesis is actually God's thought process? Well, in order to create this, I need that. In order for that, I need this. In order for this, I need that. Do you understand what I'm saying? That in Genesis, when we're looking at the 6 days of creation, it took 6 days for God to plan out the intellectual model for which the physical universe will then be predicated upon. And or, It took God 6 days to formalize the intellectual archetypes which are predicable of the manifest universe. Okay? How about that? We'll concede right there. It's the most important breakthrough in science ever, I know. But it takes a certain mind to do it. You have to be able to think both ways. And that's something that I really liked about Philo's explanation of creation, the philosophy behind creation, because what he's essentially saying, what he's talking about, when he's talking about the physical universe, he's talking about, and he says specifically, he says, and I quote, the world that we experience through our external senses, right? So he's making, without saying it, he's making a difference between the external senses and the internal senses. One of the internal senses, there's two internal senses that he mentions. He doesn't call them internal senses, but he does call them by name. The intellect and the imagination. So now let's travel back in time to the 70s with bicameral mind theory by Julian Jaynes. How the left and right hemispheres of the brain generate and or are generated by two separate mental fields. So now let's apply that theory to what Philo is saying and say that the left brain is responsible for the intellect and the right brain is responsible for the imagination. Holy shit. Did you just do it? I think I did. I think we just did. I think we just proved the Bible. Well, I mean, we proved it in a problematic sense. We perfected the syllogism. Who would have thought that? All you had to do was just study Aristotelian logic, which requires an active imagination, because you have to be able to visualize the concepts. Because the way that Aristotle explains syllogism is through visuals. Like I was saying before, there's three components of a syllogism. There's the major premise, there's the middle premise, there's a middle term that lives in between the major and minor terms. And then our proposition. Now the major and the minor, they're called the extremes. Now the two premises that we're weighing against each other, this is Aristotle's special, this is Aristotle's theory on special relativity, by the way, which is a lot different from Einstein's, but it's all relative. So one proposition is composed of the major and middle term, and then the second proposition is composed of the minor and middle terms. And then the conclusion, the ultimate conclusion that we're trying to draw, is the marriage of the major and minor terms. So what did we do today? What'd you do today? How was your day today? What'd you do? Now, mind you, this is God's telling me right now, what you just did is something that only the one can do. So anyone who needed proof, anyone who needed proof that I am the one, just got it through what we just did today. What do you want to title this? Hashem, what do you want to title this? We only have like 2%, 1%. We need to think of a name really quick. What are two titles? Biblical science? Biblical. Aristotle meets Genesis. When Aristotle read Genesis. Or when Philo met the Moshiach.